wind cuts through the heavy wool of a Midwestern autumn coat in November, carrying with it the scent of decaying leaves and the distant, metallic hum of industry. It is a time of year that signals the end of things, the closing down of the vibrant summer, and the onset of the long, gray winter. But in 1978, in the town of Speedway, Indiana, the cold brought something far more permanent and far more chilling than the changing of the seasons. It brought a silence that has lasted for nearly 5 decades. Welcome to DCF Investigations. Tonight, we are opening the files on one of the most baffling, mishandled, and heartbreaking cases in American criminal history. We are walking back into the neon glow of a fast food restaurant on a Friday night, where 4 young lives were extinguished in a spasm of violence that defies logic. And this is the story of the Burger Chef murders. To truly understand the magnitude of this tragedy, we must first immerse ourselves in the atmosphere of Speedway, Indiana, in the late 1970s. This was not just any suburb. It was a town defined by velocity, home to the Indianapolis Motor Speedway and the legendary Indy 500. It was a community that prided itself on mechanics, engineering, and the roar of engines. It was a place where blue-collar families raised their children with the expectation of safety, hard work, and suburban tranquility. In 1978, the concept of stranger danger was in its infancy. The idea that a group of young employees could vanish from a well-lit establishment on a busy road was inconceivable. Fast food restaurants were the new town squares for the American teenager. They were places of employment, social convergence, and innocent commerce. The Burger Chef on Crawfordsville Road was one such hub. On the night of Friday, November 17, 1978, the crew closing the store consisted of 4 young people who represented the very best of their generation. There was the assistant manager, 20-year-old Jayne Friedt. Jayne was known for her responsibility and her gentle demeanor. She was the leader of the shift, the one entrusted with the keys and the cash. A young woman building her life with a seriousness that garnered respect from her peers. Working alongside her was 17-year-old Ruth Shelton, a spirited and hardworking teenager who balanced her job with the typical demands of high school life. Then there were the 2 16-year-olds, Daniel Davis and Mark Flemmonds. Daniel was a quiet, artistic soul, a boy who loved photography and had a gentle presence that put people at ease. Mark was the youngest, a vibrant African-American student who had picked up the shift to help out, a detail that adds a layer of tragic coincidence to the night. They were kids. They were the faces you would see at the counter, handing over a bag of burgers with a smile, worrying about homework, crushes, and the weekend ahead. The timeline of that evening began as mundanely as any other. The dinner rush had faded. The lobby was cleared of customers. The fryers were being scrubbed and the floors were being mopped. Between 11 p.m. and midnight, the crew was wrapping up their duties. The back door, usually kept locked for security, was the only point of entry or exit for taking out the trash. At some point during that final hour, the routine of closing the store was shattered. A fellow employee stopped by around midnight to help close up, but found the back door standing open. This was the first anomaly. Entering the store, he found it empty. The lights were on. The visual tableau was confusing, but not immediately terrifying to the untrained eye. It looked as though the crew had simply stepped away. However, as the minutes ticked by and no one returned, the scene began to feel wrong. The employee called the police, but the initial response from the Speedway Police Department would become the first in a long line of catastrophic errors that plagued this investigation. When officers arrived, they did not see a crime scene. They saw a case of employee embezzlement. The petty cash was missing, approximately $581. Mass in the cynical eyes of law enforcement at the time, this looked like 4 kids who decided to take the night's earnings and go on a joyride. They assumed Jayne, Ruth, Mark, and Daniel were out partying, laughing at their little rebellion. Because of this assumption, the police did not seal the scene. They did not dust for fingerprints immediately. They did not grid the area for tire tracks. They simply took a report and left. What happened the next morning is perhaps the most painful detail for the families of the victims. Early Saturday morning, the day crew arrived to open the burger's chef. Unaware that a major crime had occurred and annoyed by the mess left behind, they proceeded to clean the restaurant. They scrubbed the counters. They mopped the floors with bleach. They wiped down the surfaces. In doing so, they unwittingly destroyed almost every piece of physical evidence that the perpetrators might have left behind. Fingerprints, hair fibers, muddy footprints, and perhaps even blood evidence were washed away and flushed down the drain. By the time the police realized that the 4 employees had not returned home and that their cars were still in the parking lot, the crime scene was sterile. The realization that this was not a joyride, but an abduction, settled over the town like a suffocating blanket. Sunday, November 19th, brought the grim confirmation that everyone had begun to fear. About 20 miles away from the burger's chef, in the rural, wooded terrain of Johnson County, hikers stumbled upon a scene of horror. The location was rugged, off the beaten path, a place one would only go if they knew the area well. There, amidst the fallen leaves and the stark trees, lay the bodies of the 4 missing employees. The condition of the victims and the manner of their deaths suggested a chaotic and brutal end. Ruth Shelton and Daniel Davis were found lying side by side, face down. They had been executed. Both had been shot in the back of the head and neck area with a .38 caliber weapon. The cold efficiency of their deaths suggested control, a demand for compliance that ended in finality. Jayne Friedt, the assistant manager, was found a short distance away. Her body told a different story. She had been stabbed twice in the chest. The knife was driven with such force that the handle had broken off, leaving the blade embedded in her body. The handle was missing, a crucial piece of evidence that would never be recovered. None of the most perplexing and heartbreaking discovery was the body of 16-year-old Mark Flemmonds. Mark was found further away from the others, near a tree. He had not been shot, nor had he been stabbed. His death was the result of blunt force trauma to the head, likely from a chain or a heavy object. But the actual cause of death was asphyxiation. He had choked on his own blood. The position of his body and the nature of his injuries led investigators to theorize that Mark had tried to run. In the darkness of the woods, amidst the chaos of his friends being murdered, he had made a desperate dash for freedom, only to run blindly into a tree or be struck down as he fled. He fell unconscious and unable to clear his airway. He died alone in the dark. The autopsy reports and the crime scene analysis painted a picture of terror. When it appeared that the 4 had been kidnapped from the restaurant, forced into a vehicle, possibly the perpetrator's van, and driven to this remote location. Jayne's car, a Chevrolet Vega, was found abandoned in town, not far from the restaurant, suggesting the abduction happened partly in her vehicle, or that the killers moved it to confuse the trail. One detail that stood out was that Jayne was missing one of her shoes. She had been led into the woods with one bare foot, stepping on the cold, hard ground of November, a detail that emphasizes the vulnerability and the hurried nature of the crime. As the investigation officially launched, the Speedway police, now working with the Indiana State Police, faced an uphill battle. They had a cleaned crime scene at the restaurant and a wooded area in Johnson County that had been trampled by the initial search parties. The physical evidence was scant. They recovered the bullets, which pointed to a .38 caliber revolver, a very common weapon. They had the blade from Jayne's chest, but without the handle, it offered few clues. They found a few cigarette butts in the van of the suspect vehicle. But in 1978, DNA testing was the stuff of science fiction. The investigators began to build profiles of potential suspects. The primary theory was a robbery gone wrong. The burger chef was located near a major thoroughfare. It was closing time. It was a soft target. But the violence seemed disproportionate to the meager sum of $500. Why kidnap 4 people? Why drive them 20 miles away? Why execute them? This level of escalation suggested panic or perhaps recognition. Had one of the victims recognized a robber? This line of questioning led to the first major group of suspects, the shotgun robbers. In the months leading up to the murders, a gang had been hitting fast food restaurants in the Indianapolis area. Their modus operandi involved shotguns and terrorizing the staff. 2 men, Clay and Donaldson, fit the description of these robbers. However, despite intense scrutiny, police could never firmly place them at the burger chef that night. Their robberies usually involved locking staff in freezers, not abducting them and driving them across county lines. The level of violence at the burger chef scene didn't match their previous crimes, which were purely transactional. Then came the sketches. Witnesses who had been in the area that night reported seeing 2 men loitering near the restaurant. One was described as having a beard. A forensic artist created a clay bust of this bearded man, and images of it were plastered across newspapers and television screens throughout Indiana. It became the face of the boogeyman. Thousands of tips poured in. Every man with a beard in a 50-mile radius was looked at with suspicion. But the bearded man remained a ghost. No name was ever attached to the face with any certainty. As the weeks turned into months and months into years, the theories grew darker and more complex. One theory suggested that this was not a random robbery, but a targeted hit. Rumors swirled about Jayne Friedt's brother, James. It was whispered in the local bars and living rooms that James had accrued a drug debt or had run afoul of dangerous men. The theory posited that the killers came for Jayne to send a message to her brother or to collect on a debt, and the other 3 employees were simply collateral damage, witnesses who had to be eliminated. This theory gained traction because of the specific brutality directed at Jayne, the stabbing, versus the execution-style shootings of Ruth and Daniel. It felt personal. However, James Friedt vehemently denied these allegations, and police could never find concrete evidence linking his troubles to the massacre. Another avenue of investigation led to the son of a prominent local politician. In small towns, power protects its own, and Speedway was no exception. There were whispers of a cover-up, of a group of wealthy, bored young men who had taken a prank too far or who were acting out a dark fantasy. This theory was fueled by the strange lack of progress in the case and the initial incompetence of the police. Was the crime scene cleaned up just because of negligence, or was it allowed to be cleaned? While compelling to conspiracy theorists, no hard evidence ever surfaced to indict any local elites. The case went cold. The 1980s arrived, bringing new hairstyles, new music, and a desire to forget the horrors of the past. But for the families of Jayne, Ruth, Mark, and Daniel, time had stopped in 1978. They lived in a perpetual state of grief and unanswered questions. Then, in 1986, a glimmer of hope emerged from the darkness. A man named Donald Forrester, who was already serving a prison sentence for rape, contacted investigators. He claimed to have information about the Burger Chef murders. Forrester was a career criminal, a man who lived in the shadows. He told investigators that he had been involved in the crime to collect a debt owed by Jayne's brother. He spun a tale that fit the targeted hit theory perfectly. He claimed that he and 3 other men had gone to the restaurant to scare Jayne. But things had spiraled out of control when Mark Flemmonds intervened, leading to a fight and the subsequent abduction. Forrester provided details that only the killers or the police would know. He knew about the broken handle of the knife. He knew the location of the bodies. He even led police to a wooded area where he claimed they had thrown the gun, though the weapon was never found. For a moment, it seemed like the case was solved. Forrester was willing to confess to avoid a transfer to a harder prison. But then, the confession began to unravel. Forrester was a manipulator. He changed his story. He recanted, then confessed again. He gave names of accomplices who had solid alibis or who simply didn't exist. The police eventually concluded that while Forrester might have had knowledge of the crime, perhaps he heard it from the real killers in the criminal underworld. He was likely not the primary perpetrator. He died in prison in 2006, taking whatever secrets he truly held to his grave. The tragedy of the Burger Chef murders is not just in the violence of the act, but in the evolution of forensic science that came too late. In the years since 1978, DNA technology has revolutionized criminal justice. The Golden State Killer, the Grim Sleeper, monsters who thought they were safe were brought down by genetic genealogy. Investigators have returned to the evidence from the Burger Chef case time and time again. They have tested the clothing, the bullets, the few items that remain. But the tragedy of the initial cleanup and the degradation of evidence over nearly 50 years has created a wall that science has yet to breach. There is a palm print found on Jayne's car that has never been matched. There are hairs that lack the root for nuclear DNA testing, though mitochondrial DNA offers a slim hope. We must also consider the psychological impact on the community. The Burger Chef murders changed Speedway. It ended the era of innocence. Parents stopped letting their teenagers work late shifts. The buddy system became a mandate, not a suggestion. The Burger Chef building itself eventually closed. It stood for years as a grim monument to the unsolved mystery, a scar on the landscape. It was eventually demolished, and the land was repurposed. But the memory of what happened there remains etched in the collective consciousness of Indiana. Today, 4 red oak trees stand in a memorial park, planted in honor of Jayne, Ruth, Mark, and Daniel. They grow tall and strong, a living tribute to lives cut short. But they also stand as silent sentinels over a justice denied. As we analyze the case today, we are left with a puzzle where the pieces have been warped by time. Was it a robbery by a traveling gang who panicked? The efficiency of the executions suggests a hardened criminal element. Was it a local grudge? The personal nature of the stabbing suggests rage. Or was it a random act of evil, a lightning strike of violence that had no rhyme or reason? The most chilling possibility is that the killers lived out their lives among the population. They may have been neighbors, co-workers, or family men who buried their dark secret deep inside. They may be elderly men today, watching the news, wondering if the knock on the door is finally coming. Or they may be dead, having escaped earthly justice entirely. The files on the Burger Chef murders remain open. The Indiana State Police continue to field tips. Every anniversary brings a renewed plea from the surviving family members. They are older now. Some of the parents have passed away without knowing who killed their children. But the siblings, the friends, the classmates, they remember. They remember the empty desks in school, and they remember the closed casket funerals. They remember the fear that gripped their town. This case serves as a stark reminder of the fragility of justice. It highlights how a single assumption by a responding officer that the kids were just out joyriding can derail an investigation for decades. It shows us the devastating consequence of a contaminated crime scene. But it also shows the resilience of the human spirit, the refusal to forget. As we close the file on this episode, I want you to look at the faces of Jayne Friedt, Ruth Shelton, Daniel Davis, and Mark Flemmonds. They were not just victims. They were the future that was stolen. They are the reason we continue to dig, to question, and to remember. This has been a deep dive into the Burger Chef murders by DCF Investigations. We have walked through the woods of Johnson County and stood in the silent kitchen of a fast food restaurant, frozen in 1978. The question that haunts us is not just who did it, but why. Why such brutality for such a small reward? I want to hear your thoughts. Do you believe the theory of the drug debt? Or was this a random robbery turned massacre? Is it possible that the bearded man is still out there? Leave your analysis in the comments below. The truth is often hidden in the details, and perhaps one of you holds the key that unlocks this mystery. Until next time, stay observant, stay safe, and never stop searching for the truth.